So today we're going to start with unity and coalition building. And yesterday this talk about strategy and tactics focused quite a bit on external factors. How does a movement deal with external adversaries? There was some talk about capacity building and a movement trying to build its own strength, but a lot of it had to do with looking at the adversary. Thinking that the adversary is the movement's big challenge, right? We spend a lot of time when we look at movements thinking about, well, how repressive is the adversary and so forth. But what if, in some cases, the biggest challenge for a movement isn't the adversary? What if the biggest challenges sometimes are internal? What if the biggest challenge is simply unifying and working together? I saw this really funny little greeting card in a store the other day, and it had this picture of this young woman looking straight at the viewer, and underneath it says, "My idea of a stressful job is one where I have to work with other people." Because it's really, really hard to build the movement, to have coalitions that work together, and to keep that unity. And the challenges to a movement change. So a coalition may start, but then later on, when we'll get into this later, it could have different forces that start pulling it apart. It's very, very challenging. So unity may be a movement's greatest challenge. And that's actually why I have a second name for this presentation. And my second name is why leading a movement is one of the toughest jobs in the world. And I actually talked to my friend about this. He said, "Don't say that. You'll just discourage people." But I'm actually not trying to discourage people with the second title. And obviously, I haven't led a movement, so this is just my observation. I'm actually trying to give credit. Because in society, the activist and the organizer doesn't get a lot of credit usually. They're kind of looked down upon. Credit goes to politicians. Credit goes to CEOs. We think about great corporate leaders, great political leaders, great military leaders. But activists don't get much credit. But their job is as tough, if not tougher. Because if you're a corporate CEO, can't you just pay people in order to make your will happen? If you're a politician, don't you have laws that allow you to make certain things happen? If you are leading a movement, what do you have? To make people do things. You can't make people do things. It's based on legitimacy. It's based on representation and the idea that people feel that a movement represents them, and that's why they come. It's extremely challenging. So I think that it's enormously worthy, obviously worthy of respect, and should be recognized as such in society. So the outline is just 3 parts. I want to give you an academic kind of definition of movement. I want to get into an exploration of what movements need to do in order to succeed. What qualities do they need to have? What are the tasks they need to do? That'll be a little brainstorm. And then I want to go through a really interesting theory or framework by the scholar and activist Bill Moyer, where he talks about 4 sort of different roles that movements have to play. And I think that my hope is that creates a lot of discussion. And it relates to unity because, as you'll see later, the 4 roles that movements have to play are often in conflict with each other. Part of a movement might need to be very rebellious, and another part of a movement might need to be very, very worried about political process, for example. And so this can create disunity. And then the last part is coalitions. And actually, I guarantee you I will run out of time, but there were 4 aspects of coalitions I wanted to hit on. Because inside of every movement, almost every movement, or every movement I've seen, is a coalition, or organizations that work together. The movement is bigger than just the organizations that work together, but the health of a coalition inside of a movement can tell you a lot about the health of a movement. And sometimes if the coalition that supports a movement fails, the movement itself fails. So they're very important to look at. And this gets to this issue of how people work together and why. Why do they even come together? If you think it's rational how coalitions come together, remember that we're working with human beings here. It's never rational, really. Or it has its own weird sort of emotional rationality. It's not just this sort of linear intellectual process. Okay, so definitions. Does someone want to just venture out a few aspects? What is a movement? What is a movement, right? It's a widely used word, right? Corporations use it, right? Oh, it's a new movement for this. It's the green movement, you know, people are buying more green products. And I've seen people who have started a Twitter hashtag that suddenly becomes popular for a week, and they say, we've started a movement, right? And I get so many emails from organizations, I'll get you in a second, Evgenia, that say, join our movement. Join our movement. Evgenia.
Для меня определение движения – это объединение людей добровольно, на добровольной основе.
For me, the definition of the movement is the voluntary unification of people, you know.
Для достижения некоммерческих целей.
So they would get non-commercial goals.
Обычно все-таки для достижения каких-то социально значимых целей.
It's mostly to gain the social important goals.
Yeah, that's pretty much my definition too. Excellent. So now I will take the simple thing Evgenia said and just make it more complex and academic. Okay? This is a definition that I have based off of 3 definitions that I found in the literature. The sources are below. So they're collective efforts aimed at bringing a consequential change. They're ongoing in the social, economic, or political order. They're civilian-based. They're popular. And they alert, educate, serve, or mobilize people. And a lot of times when people think of movements, they think mostly of the mobilization aspect or sometimes of the education aspect, but the service aspect can be absolutely critical. It's not going to make headlines, but it can be absolutely critical.
Can I just say,
Sure.
I think Charles Tilley adds the verb sustain, or the modifier sustain.
Okay. Where in the definition?
Sustain, a sustained interaction between the public making claims and the target of the claims.
Okay.
A sustained quality rather than something episodic.
Yeah. So I put ongoing, but I can switch that to sustained. Either way. That's, yeah. What Mary's saying is very important. It is exactly that. It is not a quick upsurge that's spontaneous, that goes nowhere. In fact, we see those all the time, and they often call themselves movements. But we know a movement not usually in the moment, but when we've seen over time if it can persist. I think it's absolutely critical. And so movements are voluntary. Keep driving that home. There is no command and control. And then when you're talking about that strategic triangle we had yesterday, it's very difficult to get everyone going in similar kinds of directions when everyone's there voluntarily, right? But it's possible, and we've seen it. And not, again, disclaimer, this is a model. It's not actually reality. Just an idea. They're representative because people don't volunteer unless they feel a movement represents them. They also don't volunteer, of course, unless they think the movement is actually going to achieve something, which gets back to what we were talking about yesterday with small achievements, right? Because I don't show up to a lot of actions that I'm asked to show up for because unless I think I'm going to really make a difference, I don't have enough time. They're often diverse, and Erica's work really finds, her quantitative analysis of movements finds that participation, the level of participation in movements is, if we were going to go to a single factor, one of the single most important factors, which means diversity. It's one thing to have a student movement. It's another thing to have a student movement that grows into a coalition of labor and other groups. Not an organization. An organization, if it's a formal organization, can exist on paper, and it has a budget, and it has staff, even if it's only one staff person, or it can be mostly volunteers. But it has a life that persists regardless of how many volunteers there are. A movement, if it doesn't have voluntary participation, doesn't exist. It comes into existence and it can go out. But there are lots of organizations that continue to exist year after year, even though they only have one member. Not spontaneous outbursts, to come to what Mary said. So, any comments or questions on that? Oscar, please.
Yo quisiera poner sobre la mesa el término voluntario.
I want to put up for discussion the term voluntary.
No sé si es voluntario el que, por ejemplo, como ocurrió en Cochabamba,
I don't know if it's voluntary, for example, what happened in Cochabamba,
que hubo una ley que despojaba a las comunidades de sus fuentes de agua.
there was a law, for example, that took away the right of people to their own, took away the right of communities to their own water.
La gente no lo tomó como la constitución, la creación de una organización para defender el agua.
And so the creation of an organization to defend water,
La gente no lo tomó como algo voluntario,
the people didn't view it as something voluntary,
porque tenía que ver con la existencia misma de la vida.
because to them it had to do with the very existence of life.
Entonces era una responsabilidad y una obligatoriedad
So people looked at it as a responsibility and something obligatory
establecer un espacio de resistencia
to create this space of resistance
al proceso de privatización del agua.
to the process of privatizing water.
Entonces, no estoy muy de acuerdo en que sea voluntario.
So I'm not sure I agree with the idea that it's voluntary.
Y creo que los movimientos de ayer, de hace tiempo, con los movimientos de hoy tienen una gran diferencia.
And I think that movements from years past and movements of today have one big difference between them.
Yo no sé si ahora podemos hablar de movimientos sociales
I don't know if we can talk now about social movements
o podemos más bien hablar de la sociedad en movimiento.
or if we should be talking about society in movement.
Porque lo que pasó en Cochabamba, lo que pasa ahora en Taksim, lo que pasa en Brasil ahora,
Because what happened in Cochabamba, what's happening now in Taksim, and what's going on now in Brazil,
no son como movimientos, sino es la sociedad que está en movimiento, ¿no?
it's not so much as their movements, but rather we see the whole of society in movement.
Y yo quiero poner un elemento quizás importante para la reflexión hoy.
And I'd like to talk about one particular point that I think we should reflect upon today.
Todo este movimiento de la sociedad
This whole movement of society
tiene una característica,
has one characteristic.
es la ocupación física de un determinado territorio.
It's the physical occupation of one particular territory.
La defensa del bosque,
The defense of the forest in Russia,
la defensa del presupuesto universitario,
the defense of a university budget,
la no subida de los pasajes,
defending that the price of public transportation doesn't go up.
es una defensa del territorio.
It's a defense of territory.
Es decir, la gente concibe de que en su territorio no pueden haber reglas de juego impuestas desde arriba.
So in other words, it's the idea that people have that in a people's territory, the rules of the game can't be imposed from above.
La gente está asumiendo de que en su territorio la gente debe poner las reglas.
People have this are taking for granted that in people's own territory, they need to be the ones that create the rules. Something like that.
Jim, thank you, Oscar. Jim, you wanted to mention something?
Yeah, voluntary is a difficult term, it seems to me, but it's voluntary, like what? I think there are illustrations. My wife and I decided to have children, so we've made a decision. But from the first child, we are in an involuntary track, unless we're going to be irresponsible.
That is true.
involuntariness in the whole business, being in a movement and in a union. And this is very, very problematic in the United States because we have certain groups that figure that they can have tactics of diversity.
Yes.
So they will join our struggle and want then to provoke stuff and whatnot. And I think probably, Mary, in the United States, there's a need for people who want change here to invite people not to be involved. Who will come to your gathering, your thing, and then put in their propaganda, but will not do the hard work of building it, not do the hard work of understanding what a movement must do, not do the hard work of consensus building, not do the hard work of envisioning what it is to be human and alive as we struggle for social change and social justice. So, very often in my work across the years, I've disinvited people, very frankly, who seemed had reached some kind of part in their life where they could not become a part of the struggle for whatever reason. That doesn't always work. So it's voluntariness that leads to an involuntary track. That is critical.
Right. I'm writing this down.
If you volunteer for the Army in the United States,
right,
you make the basic decision, but after that, it's all involuntary.
This is great. This is really helpful. This is great. Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, these comments make me think about this idea between personal responsibility and social co-responsibility. And this is something I was introduced to just a couple weeks ago. I was at a workshop on restorative justice practices, and it was facilitated by a guy named Dominic Barter. I don't know if any of you are familiar with restorative justice work, but he lives in Brazil, and he introduced these two different types of responsibility. And so someone said, wait a minute, what's the difference between personal responsibility and social co-responsibility? So he gave an analogy. He said, you go into a restaurant and you look at the menu and you choose from the 3 options that are on the menu in that restaurant. So it might be pasta, corn, and potato. And you make a choice on what you get from that menu. So you are 100% responsible for the choice that you make on that menu. But if you don't want pasta, you don't want corn, you don't want potato, and you want broccoli, but it's not on the menu, all of a sudden there's a sense of co-responsibility for the choice that you make. And I feel like a lot of that's coming out in what folks are sharing, where it's voluntary in the sense that you are making choices as an individual with free choice, but your choices oftentimes are limited, or the situation in which you find yourself limits your options, and you're choosing from a number of options that ideally you wouldn't want to be in this situation, but you've been put in that situation. So there's a sense of responsibility and sense of duty that also get mixed up with this idea of what we mean by voluntary in this definition.
It's almost like you choose or are chosen in a metaphorical sort of sense.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Or it's the choice is made for you. Yeah. Yeah. Keep going.
Raj Patel made a comment on something similar, where he said that you have limited choice within your democratic system, so you don't actually have democracy, you have its poor cousin, consumer choice. That was another way of saying it.
Right. Lazarus.
Yeah,
am I missing anyone on this side? I'll come to you guys next.
Yeah, to what Oscar was saying, I think the thing is he may be missing. I'm not disagreeing with him, but I think it was a question of intensity. It was voluntary even then, but the intensity or the passion they put to it is what his thinking might be different now. Because he's taking it lightly now that if you volunteer, the passion is not there. It's water. Everybody needs water. So they had a bit of more passion and intensity to that cause than perhaps to university budget. So I think voluntary still stands for me.
Oscar, please.
Quizás se podría cambiar el término. Para mí la palabra es muy importante, ¿no?
Maybe we could change the word. For me, words and terms are very important.
Es decir, una de las características del movimiento puede ser la voluntad.
So maybe one of the characteristics of a movement could be will. The will.
No que es voluntario, sino que debe existir la voluntad de organizarse, la voluntad de luchar, la voluntad de unirse, ¿no?
So maybe it's not about being voluntary, but the will to struggle, the will to get united.
Pero no como una voluntad individual, sino como una voluntad colectiva del movimiento.
But not like individual will, but rather the collective will of a movement. And just pointing out the words are similar.
Sure. Yeah, Mary and then Jenny and then Jenny. I love how the voices of experience are all chiming in. I mean, we're all voices of experience, but yes.
I just want to build on what Oscar said, because for me, the reason I became involved in the civil rights movement is that I had been studying a theologian named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a theologian of the Protestant churches in Germany, who was standing up against Nazism. He would eventually be executed for being part of a group to try to kill Hitler. And he defined freedom as the taking of responsibility. And that is what animated me, moved me, inspired me. I think this is very close to what you're saying about will. The taking, the assumption of responsibility, the shouldering of responsibility. A people who decide no longer to be passive in the face of the forces that work on them, but who decide to act out of self-reliance and take responsibility. I think that's a very important component in movement, the phenomenon.
Thanks, Mary. Okay, Evgenia and then Jenny, and then we're going to keep moving.
Меня очень взволновали слова, которые вы говорили про то, что много человек в движении вдруг начинают действовать в одном направлении.
So your comment about the movement when a lot of people like the mass start doing exactly the same things, acting in one direction, and I find it very close to me.
Потому что я являюсь лидером неформального движения.
I am a leader of a non-formal movement.
Я не могу даже записать членов моего движения, потому что это может быть опасно. У меня дома может быть обыск, и у этих людей потом будут проблемы.
I can't even keep a list of the people who participate in my movement. It might be not safe for them. I might have a search in my house, and the list can be found, and these people can suffer, great consequences.
Когда я приглашала людей в лагерь, защитников Химкинского леса, я это делала через интернет, и я никогда не знала, сколько человек ко мне придет. И сколько человек вообще в моем движении тоже не знаю.
When I organized this environmental camp to protect the forest, I used to invite the people through the internet, and I never knew what number of people will show up.
Я сделала некоторые наблюдения, что лучше всего люди двигаются в одном направлении, когда есть четкая угроза с внешней стороны.
And what I've noticed, my observation is that it's easier to attract more people, and they go into one direction when there's a threat,
Когда враг хорошо определен,
and when it is the enemy is defined, the adversary is defined, exactly who he is.
Когда цель очень понятна.
Then when the goal is very clear.
Но когда бьют не очень сильно.
But when they beat us not really very strongly, just.
Потому что когда начинают избивать, людей очень сложно собрать, они не хотят получать это.
Because and beat us severely, it's not easy then, to attract people for the movement.
То есть враг должен быть, но он не должен вас избивать.
It's good to have the enemy,
Тогда все
but not
идут на него.
very, ferocious enemy, so he wouldn't beat, us very severely. Just some beating, it's okay.
So you said a word that I am going to come back to as a really important factor sometimes in maintaining movement unity, which is threat. The research really shows that threats are actually, even if groups have different ideology and different and differences between them, that sometimes a common threat can still overcome all that and bring them together. So that we'll talk more about that later. Jenny, please.
Yeah, so maybe some of my points have been made, but I'll still just say that, you know, in the heart and mind of a person who wants to become part of a movement, they will make that initial decision and commitment that I want to volunteer myself for this cause. However, when sanctions start to be employed on the person, they then will automatically do a recheck of that. And someone sitting just very close to me, when he was facing death penalty and he was 27 and he realized that he had no way to bear a child, those are the sorts of things that go through people's minds and saying, "Geez, where am I now and what are the consequences?" And that will change the voluntarism, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. But for me, as in our organizational context, we prefer to be a structured, formal movement. And we prefer to have a way in which people commit to how they're going to behave and how disciplined they're going to be into that. If they are not willing to carry on with that voluntary approach, then they do other activities. So that's how you can try and manage that. Yeah, although I also have disinvited people, as Reverend Lawson has done. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, too, is the maintenance of unity, but at what cost? Because what if you need to differentiate and say, we're this and we're not that, and if you're that, go do that, but you're not part of this. And so it is, we'll talk more about that later, too. These are great points, and I think we're going to keep hitting on them as we go. But I just want to do a brainstorm, sort of tossing out this general question: what does a movement actually need to do to succeed? Let's say you have it doesn't really even matter about scale. It could be local, it could be national. What do they need to do? I just want sort of a list of things they need to do well. For example, they need to recruit people, would be one example.
Потому что здесь очень важна систематическая ежедневная работа. У нас в России большая проблема с тем, что люди действуют очень несистематически. То есть они готовы на какой-то один яркий шаг, а потом у них кончаются силы. И вот именно систематическое давление на системную проблему может привести к успеху.
I know for a fact, because I have encountered those challenges, and those challenges are that you need to have systematic work. The problem in Russia is often that people are willing to participate in a one-time event, to do something, but then they're not committed to diligent, consistent work.
So they need to be able to get people not just to volunteer once, but to have some kind of commitment. And they also need, I heard in that, to organize people. It came out of Jenny's. Yeah. Mariam, Lobsang, Dan, and then I'll hit this side.
Yeah, I'll just take my comment to the previous conversation, because when we were talking about that people come and they volunteer for a movement, I think sometimes when you are dedicating your time and yourself to a movement, you're not very conscious of that you're volunteering. I think you should say that you're dedicating yourself for this certain movement, and again, it's just a threat or an enemy or a vision and a goal that should be more clear when you're strategizing and designing a movement to move forward, to have a direction to it. And in order to, for a movement to be effective, I think you really need to know the starting point and your end point. You should have a clarity about that. What is your starting point and why you are starting, and what should be your end point. And you need to strategize and design it accordingly.
Okay, great. Clear goals, vision, campaign, tactics. I mean, I'm just interpreting what I'm hearing. If what I'm saying is, what you're saying is different. Okay, we'll take those two, and then we'll take, Dahlia, and then we'll move to this.
Yeah, just realistic goals that act as benchmarks so you can maintain momentum. Okay. I think like in a lot of volunteer organizations or just communities of human beings, it's tough to maintain momentum.
Okay. I'm gonna put strategy down because some of what we're getting to falls under that broad. Yeah, they need to be good strategists. Lobsang, Dahlia, and then I am going to move to the other side, and then I'll come back. Yeah.
I think training is really important.
Training. They need to train people in what?
To get organized and
and to react on certain issues when if your opinion is very repressive, and then how you want to keep your non-violent in a very disciplined way.
So they need to train people in nonviolent discipline. They need to be able to anticipate repression and know what to do. Okay, Dahlia?
I think movements need to resonate with people.
They need to communicate and resonate. And how do you know what people think so that what you say might resonate?
Find issues that they can affect, or they can have a commitment to, not just commitment, they can relate to it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just talk.
So you have to find issues that are personal. You have to connect personally to what's important. Okay, I'm going to come back to this side, but I'm going to go to this side now. We'll start with Michael, Sivan. I love this. Shingi, Nora, Oscar, and Kratzy. Great.
This sort of draws on a couple of the last points, but I mean, within the movement, it needs some sort of dispute mediation framework there. In order to both figure out how you communicate or resonate with people, or how people maintain voice or agency within the movement, you have to have a platform where internal disagreements can be voiced and then discussed. Otherwise, you find this breaking and sort of balkanization within the movement that can then destroy it from within, and the sort of target of your action just sits back smiling and allows the sort of movement to fizzle and die on its own. So.
Right. Yeah, and I know an experienced activist who said to me what she said, there's nothing that kills a campaign faster than a really bad meeting. I mean, how many bad meetings have we all been in, right? It's tough to recover sometimes. Okay. Yeah.
So it relates constructing collective identity.
Okay. Building this united identity. Yeah. Keep going. Anyone else? Who is next? Shingi.
It needs to have a leadership that can eloquently explain the goals. Of the movement.
Needs some form of leadership. Needs the capacity to communicate, as well as the content of what to communicate. Keep going. Who's next?
You need a good investigation or contextual analysis.
Right. You need to investigate. Yep. Who's next? Okay. Yeah.
You have resources.
Resources.
Yes.
Resources. Great. We're getting all this big meta stuff, and we're forgetting that we do need some resources. We may not need lots of money or lots of things, but you need some. Katya.
Communication plan inside out.
Communication plan. Oscar.
Sí, quizás preguntas básicas como ¿qué queremos? ¿No? Está ahí.
Maybe some basic questions like what do we want? That's there.
¿Quiénes somos?
Who are we?
Lo que decía la compañera, ¿no?
What our sister just said.
Pero para mí casi nadie dijo algo que quizás sea lo más importante.
But for me, nobody has said what for me is the most important thing, maybe.
La información. La gente, si no está informada, pues no.
Information. See, if people are not informed.
Y yo creo que algo que quizás estamos asistiendo es que la gente ya no acepta una forma de organización vertical.
And maybe something that we're forgetting to say is that people really are no longer that willing to have an extremely vertical organization.
Se habla más que todo de un liderazgo colectivo.
We're talking more about these structures of collective leadership.
Y ante todo eso significa una participación de la gente en la toma de decisión.
And so that implies the participation of the people in the making of decisions.
You can also call that decentralization.
Yeah, I was going to call it participatory decision-making or decentralization. Great. Okay, I'm not even going to call on people. Just yell at a few more, and then we'll move to the next slide. Inclusive.
Everyone should have the ownership of the movement. Like everyone who is involved in the movement must have the ownership.
Right, yeah. Resilience. So, and this is just a partial list, right? Because there's more hands, right? Okay, a couple more burning hands, and then we'll stop. Oh my gosh, 4 more? Okay. All right.
I think it's really important to build alliances with the pillars of state like media, judiciary.
So a movement might need some inside game, as we say. It might need to be able to understand the system.
Like
so
you
that,
need to involve media to highlight what you're doing.
Media work, okay. Who's next? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, need a very clear monitoring process to assess the progressive achievements.
Okay, so they need feedback loop. Yep. Monitoring. Okay. Yes, Steven.
Needs to generate and sustain solidarity.
They need to build solidarity among their own people and amongst other groups that they might work with. Right? Oh, Greg.
A movement needs to sometimes have fun.
No. Really? You mean we can't just sit and talk about depressing politics the whole time? I just have endless appetite for tough political conversations, right? We're all political nerds, right? Yeah. The F word, fun. Okay. All right, I'm having fun, so we'll just keep going, right? Alice, and then Ani.
You know, I think what Greg said when I saw actually the videos made by Ivan Marovich, the sense of humor is so important. I think oftentimes we think of movement as being super serious, you know, the environment, the world is going to end, and often that doesn't attract people to your movement, whereas humor can.
Well, we're moving a little bit, and this is good, from tasks that a movement has to do to qualities that a movement needs to have to do some of those things. That's great. Okay, was there one more? Okay, Ani.
To have own informational site.
Have what?
Informational site.
Like a website or like an office? Okay, sure. At this point, having a web presence is very important for many movements. Okay. Okay, Jenny.
Manage fear.
Manage fear. All right. Awesome.
Страхом нельзя управлять, оно просто надо думать. How can you manage fear? You just have to forget about it.
Okay, well, that's a very good conversation we can have, but maybe, actually, can we come back to that in the block on repression maybe later today? Which is, okay, because we have a block where we're going to talk about that. Clearly no one fears me because everyone keeps going, which is great. Okay, my point here, and I would go even further, some movements need to be able to manage a budget well. Some movements need to have good access to the legal system. Some movements need really good technical expertise. It could be about banking practices. It could be about, you know, various internet things. I mean, so many skills, right? And no one organization can do it all, usually, right? You need diverse groups. It's a team sport. That's the point. And so organizations sometimes, when they think, well, we're going to start a movement, we're going to lead it, unless you can do all those things and more, you're not necessarily just going to lead your movement or give an organization. It's going to involve a coalition. It's going to involve diverse roles. And then these roles can conflict. Because what people want when they think about what's going on inside the government and trying to have access there, they might not like what the more sort of what we call radical or militant wing wants to do. Maybe there's a part of the movement that's raising money, and they're very concerned with the kind of communications that are going out because they're concerned that that could affect their ability to make money. So there's huge tasks here. It's a team sport, and the tasks almost always conflict in some way. And so in a sense, I almost think of it like a family, right? Because you could still love your family, but not agree with them on everything. And you could still fight and have open disagreements. But I just want to sort of point to this, you know, if this is your movement, there might be lots of forces pulling it together, but at the same time, so many forces pulling it apart. And those are just internal ones. Externally, the adversary may target just a certain part of the movement, try to bribe them off, or try to attack another one, and split it that way. So it's this extreme pressure. And when you read a very basic analysis of movements, they don't talk about this disagreements. And I haven't been in a movement, so I don't know, but I know what I hear and I know what I read. And what I hear, when you really get into it, it's lots of disagreement. Jim.
I think from a nonviolent perspective, a movement must be engaged in becoming community, similar to the community it wants to see. I think that it has to become a community in which all the different people are treated with dignity and equality. So it's a learning process.
That's great.
A movement must become an incubator where people discover who they are as human beings and get on that journey. So I list those three major things. It must become an illustration of what it's seeking to have happen in the larger city. So it must become what we called in the South the beloved community. It must itself become a beloved community.
This speaks to understanding the link between the means and ends.
Yeah.
I just want to ditto that, because the Catholic Worker Movement is an 80-year movement, which is really long for a movement. And it is emphasized that you are practicing what you are envisioning. And it emphasizes decentralization. Each entity is autonomous, but it's very much this sense of building what, in the moment, what you just want in the future, and how you organize day-to-day life as well as political engagement.
And the word that I've heard Jim use many times through the years to describe it, and I've learned from it so often, is this word community. And I always used to think of a movement as like, okay, the movement's going to go do things, and it's going to do this, and it's going to do that. Big things, big public things, things that might make the headlines. But that's not really how they work. There's the sense of caretaking in the community, building that identity, but I'm not just trying to instrumentalize what you're saying, I'm just pointing out a few things. But to think of it as this whole other frame, as are we building a movement, are we building community, are we building both? So yeah, Ben.
It's really interesting to me that you used the verb becoming and not be. And it was really interesting that you said becoming a community and not being a community, because I think it gets at this issue of expectations, that we have to manage expectations in a movement, and that this is an ongoing process. It's something that we'll always be trying to evolve and change and grow, and not just, well, we have to be a community now, because that's probably not so realistic.
Well, I think it is realistic. The Polish solidarity movement of working people, industrial factories, shipyards, in the process of, at least especially in the 80s, they determined they were going to be a community inside the plants that they occupied. They would be cooperative, living, caring for one another, treating each other with respect, participating in the negotiations, cleaning up the place, fixing the food together, and sharing to the best of the ability all aspects of what it meant to develop in a factory and to work together to change. I think that's a critical part of movement.
Definitely, I just meant that it's a constant.
It's a process.
Yes, it is. It's not static. It's an organic process, but people have to be working at that process. And the leadership, it seems to me, must be working at that. So how do you replace our often broken down political systems that we live under with making politics work for everybody, making justice, equality, the hallmarks of the political process? I don't know, in the United States, our political process is quite corrupt. It's broken down. But it's always been broken down because it never has been for the equality of women. It has never been for the equality of black people. It has never been for the equality of Native Americans. It's never been for the equality of Asians or Mexican Americans. It's never been for the equality of the poor. So it's a hard system. But I think that's the struggle of the 21st century.
Okay. If it's quick.
If it's quick, yes.
Yes, sorry. I have to keep moving. Yeah.
Yes. Some movements have to be covert.
Mm-hmm.
And also, my job in the civil rights movement was communications, in part because that was the only protection available. Not the media work for public relations so much as getting a reporter to a jail when someone was being held might be the only way of saving their life.
Okay. Here we are, a little community, aren't we? It's great. So there's great strength in our plurality and diversity, and yet to work together over a sustained amount of time is tricky or is difficult. But at its best, it is that process of becoming community, of becoming a model of that which we wish to see. One person's attempt to sort of take some of this content that we brought forward and try to organize it into sort of 4 categories is this framework that I'm going to talk to you about by Bill Moyer. And Moyer was an activist in the United States for a variety of causes. Stephen knew him. A number of people probably know him. And he is now dead, but he wrote a great book in which he tried to mix scholarship and his activism experience. And he says there are, quote, 4 roles of social activism. And again, they often conflict. The citizen, I'll go through these later. The rebel, the change agent, I'll define what these mean in a second, and the reformer. That social activists as individuals and movements need to play those 4 roles. And so what is the citizen? Here's a quote from Moyer about citizens. Social movement activists need first to be seen by the public as responsible citizens. They must win the respect and ultimately the acceptance of the majority of ordinary citizens in order for their movement to succeed. Consequently, citizen activists need to say yes to those fundamental principles, values, and symbols of a good society that are also accepted by the general public. So citizens are people who interpret the movement in a way that uses the existing symbols and values of society that people are comfortable with. A citizen may reinterpret those values in a certain way, but it starts with those familiar values. Citizen uses symbols, values, and narratives, and it holds society to those stated values and narratives. Martin Luther King and some of Martin Luther King's speeches, these are speeches that are citing widely held American values and trying to hold people to them. And there's a certain, and the way in which the citizen role can be played is to say if we hold ourselves to these values, these conservative values, maybe that calls us to do something radical. If we really mean what we say in the US Constitution, or as a Christian, or as any other religion, or so forth, maybe we actually have to step out of the citizen role sometimes, or change how we interpret the citizen role. Helps movement be perceived as legitimate, seeking public good, upholding public values. This helps protect a movement when power holders want to discredit it, and shows that everyone can get involved. So I gave a workshop at the University of Massachusetts in 2 hours west of here. And at the end of it, and there was major activism going on there is around, well, there's a few issues, but one is closing down a nuclear power plant. And after the workshop, someone came up to me and she said, I've never called myself an activist before. I don't think of myself as an activist. But I can really see now that it's not an activism thing, it's a people thing. It's not just about the activists, it's anyone can get involved. So that's the citizen role. that individuals have to play or movements have to play. But then movements might need to play the rebel role. At the same time, activists must be rebels who say aloud no and protest social conditions and institutional policies and practices that violate core societal values and principles. Someone needs to stand up and say, this is a lie. So rebels put issues on the public agenda and keep them there. Occupy in the United States had a real rebel capacity. The 99% idea in American politics wasn't part of the discourse, was not part of mainstream ideas until Occupy came in playing the rebel role, as Moyer would say, and said, we're not leaving. We're going to draw attention to this until it gets discussed, until it gets talked about. They demonstrate sacrifice. They try to inspire through sacrifice. It shows how institutions and power holders are violating trust. And when it's sustained, it raises the cost of maintaining the status quo. Because we're not leaving, we're not leaving, we're not leaving, or we're going to keep doing this until something changes. It makes it very... In Port Elizabeth, it literally raised the cost of maintaining the status quo because businesses were hurting. And same in downtown Nashville. We're going to get into discussion of these later. I just want to go through them first. Then movements need change agents. Activists need to be change agents who work to educate, organize, and involve the general public to actively oppose present policies and seek positive, constructive solutions. They need organizers. They need people who do community work. They need people who do education. They need people who serve, who figure out how to build that community locally. I think we've all established that it's very rare to find a true top-down movement. What comes up again and again when we even talk about movement or when I show the strategy diagrams, people say, well, that's nice, and so much of this happens locally. And change agents build this nonviolent power, build this grassroots power, build this community solidarity. They don't always get credit for it. It's not always a job that gets where you're quoted in the newspaper or where you get recognized in some way. But very critical, they recruit others. They frame issues locally as a way to get others involved. They build participatory democracy. They work at new forms of community decision-making. They localize and reinterpret issues. We have this local issue here, and you know what? This is directly because we have laws that allow businesses to bribe the Congress. And that's why we have this local issue here. So they tie a local issue with a national issue. And they motivate and train people. And then last is the reformer. Finally, activists must also be reformers who work with the official political and judicial structures to incorporate solutions into new laws and policies and practice of society's public and private institutions. Then they must work to get them accepted as the new conventional wisdom of mainstream society. So, I'll come to you in a second. So if a movement wants a victory in pen and ink, if a movement wants a victory in the form of a policy, a law, something official that is written out and approved and becomes the new policy, at some point there needs to be a way to at least interact with those who make those laws. And there are examples of movements that build enormous grassroots power but have no idea how to work on the inside. And then there are endless examples of groups that know how to work on the inside but has no grassroots power at all. Right? Okay. Yes?
What happens when you have too many rebels and not many rebels?
Well, we're going to get to that because we're going to get to the big family food fight that happens in movements in a second, because that's where the conversation gets fun and you don't have to hear me as much anymore. But reformers negotiate. They pursue legal remedies, legislation. They have specialized knowledge of institutions. And they help inform the movement of what's going on the inside. Okay. So one big happy family, right? So the fights, we can already anticipate some of the disagreement and philosophical differences if you accept this framework between these different roles, right? The rebel gets more press coverage. The change agent feels undervalued. The reformer says, what are you doing? This is messing up my negotiation. The citizen says, whoa, whoa, this is getting a little too far out. Rein it in. I mean, there's all kinds of issues that can happen. And what Moyer says is that good, experienced, mature activists and organizers play several roles, and some can play all 4 roles. And so, for example, we have Martin Luther King, at times playing the citizen, even wearing the dress of the citizen, the suit. We have Reverend James Lawson. But playing multiple roles in that struggle, not tied to any given one. Here is in a very different capacity, which you'd call, Moyer would say the rebel. And yet they're wearing the suit of the citizen, so there's a mixing of roles. Here, we have Yevgenia with her daughters. She's a nice citizen. But if you make her mad, she's also a rebel. But then she sets up the camp in the forest and becomes the change agent, right? Oh. I'm sorry. Okay. Evgenian is a citizen and the nicest rebel you'll ever meet. So then, oh, look who else we have. We have Jenny and her colleague and Magodonga, and they are organizers in their community, organizing local structured campaigns. They're also calling on traditional values of women and their role in society, which is a citizen kind of role. Jenny can tell you plenty of stories in which she has played the rebel. We have Oscar, who has set up schools to educate laborers, a change agent kind of role, but also been willing to lead, criticize, be vocal, take positions that say this system is not just, very publicly and openly, and also is arguing, in my reading of Oscar's work, for indigenous values, which is a role of citizenship. We have who was yesterday described as an extreme troublemaker in the film. Again, able to play multiple roles. And here we have Lech Walesa, Polish leader, signing documents, agreements with the communist government in Poland, playing the reformer role, but just as good at playing the rebel or the change agent or the citizen. So that's just to give an example of leaders and how great leaders have this wonderful fluidity. They can even play 2 roles at the same time, sometimes 3. And they're comfortable with the different roles. But when things become too balanced with one role or another, there can be this tension in the movement. Though you could say, maybe at an early stage of the movement might need more rebels to get things on the agenda. Maybe they don't need as many reformers, but maybe later on they need more reformers. It's tough to say. It might depend on the movement. Comments or questions or thoughts? Yeah.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it's related to what you were talking about, but the idea of movement is dragging getting people into this movement. Sometimes you don't have the power to choose those people. So in my case, or in the Yemeni revolution, it was a movement, and then one of the friends of the former president became part of the movement, and he was actually trying to drag people into the violent. It's a non-violent movement, and he was actually trying to destroy this movement, and this is what he has done.
Friends of the former president.
Yeah, exactly. So we didn't get the power to tell him that you're not allowed to become part of the movement because you don't have the power to say that. So I guess this is a really
it is a huge issue.
Yeah, exactly.
Your question is a great question, and I know it's a question that other people in the room have. There's going to be a whole session later. I think, Howard, are you doing the session on radical flanks? Yeah. There's actually a whole session that's going to be dedicated to about violence and violent actors within movements and how to deal with it. So I'd rather wait for then. But Howard, if you can talk about that, provocateurs and people who try to move a movement towards violence, that would be great. Thank you. Okay. Remarkably few comments. Okay, Nora. I mean, it's okay. I haven't even started on coalitions yet. We have more to do. But Nora, Oscar, and then again.
I just think this is such an important part to recognize that people in a movement aren't some, altruistic individuals that are perfect human beings in any way, You're dealing with a lot of egos, a lot of ideas, and that leads to conflict when people want to get the credit and so on. I think this really allows you to sort of try to look at the different types of people and what roles people are playing, and then I think the real question is, how do you manage all of that? But yeah, just to say that I think it's really important to recognize these things.
Yeah, absolutely. And the tension there, yeah.
Well, this is kind of a combination of things that we were just talking about, Oscar and me. But in terms of this idea of the reformist, Oscar thinks that it's foremost and paramount that movements make their own rules for how they want society to be. And then we also think that when you get an opponent, a government, or a system to enact structural changes, it needs to be as a reaction to the will of the terms that the movement has already established. So, for example, if you show by example the change that you want to make, and then exercise the will to make your opponent make a specific change in a law or a systemic change, you're both demonstrating the change in your own actions and what you're building, but you're also understanding how to exercise that force against your opponent to make them respond to the terms that you've already put forth.
And so, if I'm hearing you correctly, part of what I'm hearing is political change in the system. Part of what I'm hearing is change in the political culture, and then part of what I'm hearing is also social change in how people conceive of themselves. And so you can't just conceive of the movement victory as just, a law was passed, done, let's all go home now. That the change has to be much deeper and comprehensive. Is that part of? Yeah.
And I think that we talked about how we're seeing more and more frequent uses of what we call civil resistance, and that there's a muscle that's getting stronger and is able to more effectively and more consistently and more rapidly and with less time elapsing between those movements enact or affect change or exercise or pressure change on societies, which is both changing the rules of society but also making very specific concrete policy changes within the existing structure.
Thank you. Yeah, again, and then I'm going to keep going into coalitions.
Мне кажется, что если вы хотите привлечь много людей на свою сторону,
I think that if you'd like to attract more people, to the movement,
вы должны очень серьезно продумать свой образ.
You have to think seriously about the way you project yourself, about your image.
Вы должны не выглядеть ни в коем случае маргинально, и вы должны проповедовать те ценности, которые есть на сегодняшний день у тех людей, к которым вы обращаетесь. То есть для меня это семейные ценности.
You don't have to look marginal. You have, to go with promote the values, which are the values of the people you attract to the movement. And for me, these values are mostly the family values.
И поэтому, когда лидер выглядит очень агрессивно,
so when the leader looks aggressive,
это отталкивает.
So it repels people.
И это пугает обычного человека.
It threatens the common, person.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And this is, I don't want to get into it, but sometimes people talk about forms of property destruction and it's not violent, and can we do that? And I think your point really speaks to how people's conduct always has to be keeping that in mind of, are we appearing threatening to the common person? Either physically or just in terms of values that are widely held. Yeah. Okay, coalitions. I want to give you a definition of coalition. It's very simple. Here's the academic version, but I'll just tell you in regular words. It's just people two or more groups working together at any scale. Might be for a brief time, might be for a long time. Might be formal, might be informal. Stephen.
When Bernice Johnson Reagan, leading civil rights activist and singer and musicologist, one of my favorite quotes ever. She says, "If you are comfortable with everybody in your coalition, you're not in a coalition."
Somebody tweet that. So here's a definition of coalition. And so here's my, again, you know, I'm a very talented artist. So I've done this PowerPoint diagram. And so here is the movement, which is this big egg, and here are organizations in the movement. Now, if those organizations aren't in coalition, then the scale, the scale of their influence might be a little bigger than their core staff or members, but not that much bigger. But when you get them in coalition, ooh, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And again, within movements are so often coalitions. And coalition health can be movement health. And so here we see Tahrir Square, right? Some might refer to it as a crowd. Some might refer to it as protesters. But I refer to it as a coalition. This was on the BBC website. And here they have mapped out all the different groups that are working together with different functions to make that occupation last. So it's interesting to look at this as even to make a tactic work at a very base level, there needs to be a coalition of groups working together. And if you want, I can send out the URL for this. You can roll over these and it will tell you more about each thing. But I mean, just think for a second, what if this coalition wasn't there? Where would people go to the bathroom? I mean, there'd be problems, right? I mean, there'd be all kinds of problems. Who'd get the food? Okay. So there's different types of coalitions, formal, informal. The second one I want to focus on, vanguard coalitions and integrative coalitions. So a vanguard coalition is the, hey, everybody, follow me coalition. We're going to lead it. So here you'd have, for example, a labor union that wants to get higher wages in their particular store, say a Walmart, and they want everyone to line up behind them so that they can get better wages in their Walmart. An integrative coalition would be where all the groups come together, and instead of getting behind just one group's agenda, they say we have a common agenda of maybe increasing the minimum wage for everyone, getting a living wage. So no one's going to get it's not just going to be one issue or another. We're going to find ways that we can all integrate our interests and work together. Now, what I have seen with organizations is so often when an organization talks about building a coalition, what kind of coalition are they talking about building? A vanguard coalition. Most organizations don't say, let's go build a coalition where our mission may not be the prime thing moving that coalition. Or let's go dilute our power by joining 20 other organizations and then we'll just be one name on the letterhead. I mean, some do. But so often people say, on this issue, everyone needs to get behind us. And just to show there are different kinds, another example of a coalition in the United States would be, environmental groups and labor groups coming together and saying, we need to get money out of politics if either of us are going to get our objectives. We need to end the corruption before we can get our objectives. Instead of, we're going to push for environmental stuff, come to us, and we're going to push for labor stuff, come to us. Were there comments or questions? Okay. And then another would be insider coalitions and outsider coalitions. Coalitions of influence, that's sort of another name for it. I don't love that name because outsider coalitions can be very influential, but some coalitions are mostly insider, some are mostly outsider, some are both. Just ways to think about it. Now, there are great benefits to working in coalition. I'm going to zip through them because I think the more interesting conversation is, if the benefits are so great, why don't people do it more? Why is it so hard to do? So, campaign, you get access to resources. A small organization can get access to more resources. They can get access to skills and expertise. We went down that list there of all these different qualities movements need. They need skill. They need expertise. You know, movements need to not just be experts in their own issue, but I would say that it really helps movements to have expertise in other issues in the society, because that's part of how you understand who else might work with you in coalition. If you only understand your issue, how do you understand how your issue bridges with others? So access to lots of skills and expertise is very valuable. Access to networks and contacts. Here, actually, I'm going to zip through this now. I'm not going to focus on that at the moment. Legitimacy. Let's go back to our example of a labor union. If a labor union is pursuing increased wages in their one place of work, and they say, come join us, someone could say, you're just trying to do something to benefit yourself. This isn't my struggle. You just want more money, and maybe you deserve it, and maybe you don't, but it's not my struggle. In the US, we call those special interests. You're just a special interest. You just want something that's good for you, and you want me to support you. But if a labor union, if laborers are able to get in coalition with other groups, like say church groups and student groups, they'd say, it's not just us. Look, these church groups and student groups also think what we're doing is important. So it's clearly not just about our self-interest. In the example I gave you yesterday of the United Farm Workers, this is taken in the city of Seattle, Washington in 1969. Here you have a predominantly white, seemingly middle class or upper middle class neighborhood. It looks like at the base of Queen Anne Hill. And look at how they're dressed. And they're boycotting a Safeway grocery store because it's selling grapes. Now, this gives legitimacy, new legitimacy, increased legitimacy to those Mexican American and Filipino American migrant laborers who are striking down in Southern California. To some audiences, they see this and they say, maybe there is something for me in this struggle that I didn't realize. Revitalization of organization and approach. Every organization can get into groupthink. It's very helpful to get new ideas. Developing new leaders. There is a skill set that is not usually valued in society or organizations as much, and that is the capacity to build and work in coalition. There are people who are extremely good at navigating between organizations, and I think that's a form of leadership. Raise the public profile. So there's all these benefits, right? Okay. What are some of the drawbacks? What are some of the drawbacks? Yeah.
One organization that is taking all the power or has more leadership than others, so the others get, I don't know, apart. I don't know.
Yeah, so you can what we'd call the dilution of a mission. Like one organization gets so much influence that the other ones can't stay on their mission. Sure, what else? Anna. Conflict of interest. So they can get into, and conflicts of interest are expensive. They waste time. They spend a lot of time and energy and people and goodwill. Yeah.
Disagreements within the coalition can confuse messaging and goal decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, every group has to ask, can we compromise on our message on this particular issue if we need to? And then if they do, you know, is the compromise going to be something they can live with? Or is it going to affect, you know, anything? Their funding base, their recruiters, their staff, are they going to be mad? And all of these different issues. Sure. Oscar. And then Lazarus, and then anyone here. Okay, and then Angela.
Quizás el riesgo es que un gran riesgo que yo he visto.
Maybe the risk is a big risk that I've seen.
Es que los principales, a mí no me gusta hablar mucho de líderes, los principales referentes, los principales portavoces de un movimiento.
I don't like to talk so much about leaders, but that the principal spokespeople or reference points for a movement.
Muchas veces son cooptados por los partidos políticos.
Oftentimes they get co-opted by political parties.
Y el movimiento, pues, se diluye o la gente se siente como traicionada porque ese esfuerzo colectivo fue usado por una persona para pasarse al otro lado.
And the movement might get diluted, or people feel betrayed because one person used this collective experience for their own personal benefit.
Sí.
And I think Oscar's making, everyone got the point. I've read some interviews with Oscar, and actually I'm going to rush to it. I actually put a quote from Oscar in here on that point, because when I was reading an interview with him, I thought it was so good. It was a different Oscar, another Oscar Oliver. So in the Bolivian context, you have a social movement, and then you also have this political party that claims to represent the social movement, and some of the leaders came out of the social movement. And then when that part of that coalition gets insider status, gets power, you have this real problem that Oscar was talking about. Okay. I was going to take Lazarus, and then I was going to go to Angela and Jenny. Yeah.
Credibility issue.
Credibility.
Yeah. On the other hand, you have this credible group that their antecedents fits very well then, and everybody kind of like what they are doing and the future they are hoping for. And then they need to build a coalition with this other group that their antecedents don't look so good, but for the time, in the moment, you need them and they seem to be doing. This is the example. In Nigeria, for instance, there is this politician who used to be in the mainstream and was a congressman and even fought on the floor of the House and threw punches actually, and is on YouTube, is everywhere. Now at the moment, he's about the biggest change crusader. You want to work with him, and then somebody says, this guy is a hoodlum. I mean, but you need him in the moment because his passion is awesome. So the issue of the risk of having people who are not so credible come into a coalition with you can stand in the way of your movement.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, Angela, and then Jenny, and then we're going to go on.
My point was on the same lines as Laz's, which was just the flip side of legitimacy. On the positive side, it can be also a negative if one of the groups that you're in a coalition with doesn't have such a great reputation, but they have something that's valuable.
Though keep in mind as well, coalitions can be both long-standing, which we might refer to more as an alliance, or short-term. And so sometimes the same politicians who are called sellouts in the beginning might actually be useful later on. And so in a sense, keep in mind, there might be a sustained coalition of a certain size and then temporary coalitions on certain issues. But absolutely, absolutely. Jenny.
Yeah, so I just wanted to support what Oscar was saying. We've had the same experiences. But also I think the challenge for us has been that sometimes people appreciate peaceful protest as a legitimate form of putting pressure, but they're not brave enough to do it. And so our bad experiences were being used by organizations that wanted protest on their issues, but were not brave enough to even hold their own placards. And so that caused problems. But I think the most important thing is how you have a memorandum of understanding, and there must be an equal basis upon which you partner on issues. So I think that was our bad experience.
And the thing is, and I will come to you in a second, just to, at least, again, drawing from the literature, what may seem like an equal understanding at one point in a struggle might change later on as one organization gets bigger, another one gets smaller, or one takes on more risk and another one takes more of just like, okay, we provide, background resources. And so those agreements can get stressed as well. Kusta.
Yeah, sometimes you can have a situation where, let's say we are these strong environmentalists here, and we believe that. But there is somebody which a lot of the people here, I think, are scared of, is coming to come and exploit us. But you must weigh it and check the cost and benefit of bringing this character to yourself. An example in South Africa was in 1984 when Ted Kennedy visited our country. Remember, at that time, ideologically, we're so opposed to American or United States government or anything, because in those days we did not like we preferred to work with people who were not in government. So Kennedy was an institution of the United States and a symbol of American imperialism or whatever we were against. But we had a serious discussions across the country. Some people were opposed to this, bitterly opposed to it. But what we did, finally, we were strong enough. We said, we're not going to be influenced by Ted Kennedy, but the man carries cameras. The American society is going to see this man. That's the only way we're going to get into the homes of the American people, is through allowing Kennedy coming to our country, and he did. And from that time, the publicity of our struggle reached levels that it has never had before. And some of those who didn't participate in it, like an organization called the Azanian People's Organization, AZAPO, which was opposing Kennedy, but a small group, it managed also to assist the publicity to drive it. Although they were insignificant in South Africa, but the cameras wanted to be on this minority that did not want Kennedy. And then, of course, Kennedy came into Soweto and moved around the country. Wow. From that time onward, that was 1984, even before we started the boycott. So from that time onward, we stepped into the international stage. We never called Kennedy again, because at that time he was a divisive factor for us. We couldn't bring him anymore. But the level of publicity and exposure for our cause internationally was enhanced. So what I'm saying, when you embark on those things, you have to make the judgment call on the spot and look at it. What will it cost you? And if you are trusted by people over a period of time, then you don't have to have credibility and lose. You may lose one or two of your own friends who say, no, they are not part of that. But because you are sure of yourself, confident of your cause, and therefore you can only gain and you can only win.
You come from a position of strength. Yeah. Great. I don't want to take up people's break time, but can I have? But I do actually. Can I go 5 minutes into your break? Is that okay? But in order to do that, I'm sorry, I have to start being firm about discussion. So I'm just going to go through some key points and then we'll close. Coalition risks. Time and energy involved in establishing and maintaining trust. Of course. The thing about coalitions, too, is if I'm going to work with you or you or you or you, I have to get to know you. I have to start to understand what you're good at, what your preferences are, how you like to work, the culture of your organization, and I have to trust you. And that takes energy and time, right? It might be a lovely experience, to get to know people, but it takes energy and time. And what the literature that I've read says is that coalitions that last are ones that actually have dedicated staff people to keep doing that, trying to almost, that like it's a full-time job maintaining a coalition instead of having it be sort of the last bullet point on everyone's job description. It takes a lot of energy to get to know and trust people. But once you do it, the transaction costs of working together are much easier because you're not getting into these stupid disagreements that really are about, can we really trust you? It becomes much easier to do business that way and to work. Contamination of legitimacy we discussed, and distraction or dilution of mission. Now, factors that promote coalition formation, obviously. Shared ideology, objectives, means shared identities. But these, I think, are actually not the most important. The most important is personal social ties and trust. These are people we're dealing with again. And it gets back to that issue of, do I know you, do I trust you, do I understand you? Now, a lot of times that correlates with someone, like I probably will know people better who have a shared identity with me or a shared ideology. But it really comes down to the fact that I know them better, I think, is one of the most important things, that I'll work with them. And that shows that when coalitions form that are really effective, it's usually based on a history of knowing and getting to know people that has lasted for years. And I'm going to give you an example of this in 1 second. Organizational history is very important. When you've had an organizational culture where people have gone from one organization to another so they understand both cultures, they can be bridge builders, very important for coalitions. Now, here's an example. In 2002, there was a coalition called Win Without War. And it was in the United States, and it was founded, it was obviously against the war in Iraq, and perhaps, I don't know, against the war in Afghanistan or not, Stephen, do you? Yeah, they were clearly against the Iraq war. There were 5 founders, okay? They created this coalition quickly, okay? 5 founders. These 5 founders had all worked in different social movement organizations before, okay? And they decided they were going to make a coalition called Win Without War. So where's my marker? So here's the core 5. Okay? 24 members of that coalition ultimately were people they knew personally. They were people who worked in organizations, and they knew those people personally and had worked with them before or were good friends with them. Okay? Then the other 6 more were people that were friends of friends. And only 4, was it 4? 6 were actually completely outside. And a couple were asked to join, and a couple came and asked to join. So we see how it works with this social familiarity. Transaction costs are much lower if we're going to interact, if we already know and trust each other. And so when did this coalition form? You could say it started forming when people got to know each other years ago. And then started working, and then it was the result of that. It was the fruit on that tree. Now, what does that say? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's not necessarily either. It's just a thing. Because sometimes we think, well, those 2 groups so obviously have a similar self-interest, they should work together. If they don't have the ties and the trust, it shows that they usually don't. Now, another thing that can promote coalitions is obviously political and institutional context. Governments or corporations, but mostly governments I'll use in this example, can create shared identities, shared experiences that can bring people together. For example, in Vietnam, when there's a draft, many, many more Americans are affected by this draft than would be otherwise, and it facilitates that coalition formation, even people of very different backgrounds who don't know each other as well. Threats can definitely have a profound impact on coalition formation and can override lack of familiarity. Here you have a nurses union with Occupy Wall Street. Now, Occupy Wall Street, their culture is out of an anarchist culture. Think of the movement, think of the culture in a union in the United States, hierarchical, very organized, very top-down, very well-versed in institutional practices. Culturally, Occupy and a nurses union in the United States is actually quite different. They would not normally work together. And in fact, we can even see this because in some anti-World Trade Organization demonstrations, some labor unions who might support certain positions of the people demonstrating don't actually join those. The cultures are too different from those organizations, I would say. But a threat can bring them together. And then sometimes, I'm actually going to go through these a little quicker. Let's see. Factors that inhibit coalition, formation, I'm just going to focus on 2 and then I'll stop. Let's see, hold up. Right. Political and institutional structure, I just gave you an example with the Vietnam War where it was conducive, but it can also be divisive. So for example, if a government is able to make 20 different committees, some are local, some are national, they all deal on different little issues, then what the grassroots sometimes does is focus on each of those 20 committees And that can lead to lots of divided efforts. For example, in the United States, we have the Environmental Protection Agency, which is ostensibly involved in looking at the health of the environment. And then we have the Occupation Safety and Health Administration looking at health in the workplace. So if a chemical needs to be regulated, is it an environmental issue or is it a labor issue? And if a government is able, and I'm not saying the US is intentionally doing this, but if the government is able to split up points of impact and influence, it makes coalition building harder because people don't get the chance to work together and build the trust. In the United States, another interesting institutional example is that nonprofit organizations, a traditional 501c3, does that mean the time's up? It is up. I'll be done 1 second. Can't engage in an election. It can't take a strong positions in supporting an election. But a labor union has a different nonprofit status and can. So if you create different organizations with different statuses in different areas of activity, elections are one of the areas where coalitions are most likely to form. But if you can say these group of organizations can't really work in them, but this group can, you prevent it. So governments are very, that institutional context is very important, and some governments will certainly attempt to create institutional contexts that fragment people. We know this. But the other thing, and this is ironic, is political opportunity can be absolutely destructive for a coalition, right? To get to Oscar's point. Because if the coalition succeeds at something, then you've got some people who are insiders, and suddenly everyone's pursuing a different opportunity because, hey, we got in power. You look in the United States, during the Bush administration, you had a lot more coalitional activity on the left than you do today under a different institutional context. So opportunity is this interesting thing. It can facilitate it, but also make it difficult. If you look at the example of Egypt, everyone was united to get Mubarak out. Once there was a new system, new opportunities, things fragmented. And this, to sort of close on one of Bill Moyer's points, is that movements don't have to just win, they have to win two battles. They have to beat what they're against and then also win what they're for. And the institutional context in those might be very different, and the coalition implications of those might be very different. So my conclusion of all of this is, basically it's complicated.